Kia ora koutou katoa. Ayubowan wanakam. Welcome everyone to this exciting seminar on conducting research using everyday peace indicators within the context of Sri Lanka. I am Marini Sanka, the convener of AES Aotearoa, New Zealand. That's the Australian Evaluation Society in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the diverse lands which we come from. I am speaking from Otatau, Christchurch, Aotearoa, and I acknowledge the leaders past, present, and emerging from all the countries that are represented here today. This seminar is recorded and it will be uploaded to the AES YouTube channel in about 3 weeks, so do keep your eye out for that. And just a note to please keep your mics on mute and type your questions into the chat. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Should be a very engaging session. So as you know, Sri Lankan socio-political history has been marred with a 30-year civil war, natural disasters, and a financial crisis. In this context, the research that is presented today, using everyday peace indicators, provides valuable insights into grassroots perceptions of reconciliation, helping to address the complex interplay between social cohesion and development. So I'm very delighted to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Leslie McColman, who brings a wealth of experience in applied social science research, and her work has spanned multiple continents, focusing on rights, governance, and security issues. Leslie served as the research coordinator for Everyday Peace Indicators in Sri Lanka and is now a research scientist at Brandeis University. Joining her is doctoral candidate Zara Rizwan, a researcher with a multidisciplinary background in gender and women's studies, business, and English literature. Zara's expertise in NGO management and research was instrumental to her role as lead facilitator for EPI in Sri Lanka. Thank you both so much for being here. Over to you both.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much. We got a fabulous turnout for this session. And I'm really excited to be able to present to you along with my former colleague, Zara Rizwan, the work that we undertook in Sri Lanka to both inform and evaluate USAID programming using a fairly innovative approach called the Everyday Peace Indicators. So I want to start by giving you just a little bit of background on where this project came from. Can everyone see the screen advancing? Yes. Okay. Lessons learned giving classes over Zoom, right? So this work that you'll be hearing about today was undertaken between 2018 and 2023 under the auspices of a program called the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Project, or SCORE, which was funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development and was implemented by Global Communities, which is a large NGO that does development work in many, many countries around the world. The objectives of the SCORE program in Sri Lanka, having been designed, these are slow processes, right? Circa 2015, 2016, was quite broad. USAID, vis-a-vis the SCORE program, wanted to promote a cohesive Sri Lankan identity, a few years after a very brutal and long-lasting civil war. It wanted to promote economic development through improved service provision. It wanted to build capacity, particularly among marginalized communities and individuals within those communities. So thinking about the situation in particular of women and of youth, and provide psychosocial support to improve community resilience. So very broad objectives. Still got folks rolling in. And moreover, a national level project. This project was designed not only in the aftermath of a very serious and long-lasting episode of violence, but also in the context of what we might call the localization of aid agenda, which, so what you're seeing now, which has an image, hopefully, of USAID, Global Communities, and U.S. Institute of Peace.
Yes, yes.
Fabulous. Is in bullet points the same thing that I was verbally explaining to you, and I will try to speed it up a little bit to make up for that lost time. So the final point that I wanted to make is that this work that we undertook was very much in the context of the localization of aid agenda, which is all about channeling more resources to local communities, the beneficiaries of these projects, and also about giving those individuals and communities more say about not only the design and implementation of programs, but also in defining the metrics of success, monitoring, and evaluating the results of those projects. Which is why, through the U.S. Institute of Peace, EPI was brought in to do this work. So Everyday Peace Indicators is a small nonprofit organization. We do participatory research and evaluation work in many countries around the world, about a half a dozen, spanning Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And the goal of this work is really to put front and center the metrics that communities themselves utilize to gauge whether peace, or in the case of Sri Lanka, reconciliation is occurring where they live. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the 1-minute video that we were going to show you to give you sort of a primer on EPI, and I'll jump straight to the steps that comprise this process of generating local indicators of reconciliation and then using them to gauge the impact of specific projects or change over time on the ground. So we start by doing something really simple that's often not done, which is to ask the members of conflict-affected communities how they themselves see peace or reconciliation in their everyday life. We do this using focus group formats. We work on the one hand with groups of men, on the other hand with groups of women, and also with groups of youth, which sometimes are mixed together in multiple gender groups, or often, as in the case of Sri Lanka, we separate them out to work with younger girls and young men and young women. We listen to the stories that they tell. We probe, we ask for details, we ask them, where do you see that? Who does that? When do they do it? How often do they do it, right? And through this active listening process, we devise a long list of community-generated indicators, right? And you'll see some examples of these over the course of the presentation today. We format them, we organize them, we make them sort of intelligible, group them into categories, and then we bring them back to the same people who participated in the focus groups to verify that they do, in fact, reflect what they told us. And we then invite a much broader sample of the community, as large as we're able to accommodate, typically about 50 to 100 people, to vote on those indicators, using small stickers to say which things are the most important, gauging whether peace, justice, or in this case, reconciliation is present in their everyday lives. We often, as in the case of the work that we did in Sri Lanka, then utilize those indicators to formulate projects. EPI is not an implementing organization, so we don't actually do projects on the ground, but as occurred in Sri Lanka and has occurred elsewhere, we organize those indicators, we code them into categories, and we inform organizations like Global Communities that are actually devising and implementing projects on the ground, which is where EPI's work comes back in. At the same time those projects are implemented, we turn these indicators, which are all about what is important to people, into surveys. And we use those surveys, which are done, using representative sampling methods. So not the same people who were in the focus groups, but actually a much broader sample of the community. We use those indicators to devise specific survey questions to see sort of the baseline where the community is at the outset of a project, and in the midline or at the end, how those the status of those indicators several years later. So I know I went through that kind of fast, but hopefully some of those pieces will be a bit clearer as I explain the work that we were doing on the ground. So what I think is really important to highlight is that the work that we did in Sri Lanka had two aims, which were complementary, but were certainly very distinct. One was to inform the programs that were designed and carried out under the auspices of the SCORE program by this organization called Global Communities. And the other was to evaluate the impact of those projects in a subset of communities where they were present. Just to give you a little taste of the kinds of indicators that EPI was able to gather and to share with global communities for the purposes of designing these programs, they're really, really diverse. You can see everything from the issues related to the enforced disappeared people are being resolved in Naminadam. So this is a Tamil community that was quite impacted by the Civil War and took as a key indicator of reconciliation, seeing progress on the issue of people who had disappeared during the war or in the period thereafter. In a different part of the country, coming out of the women's focus group, a very distinct indicator that at the Kathankudi police station, women's complaints are written in Tamil. Tamil is widely spoken in Sri Lanka, but it is not the majority language. So many public servants and many police officers are fluent in Sinhala and not in Tamil, and therefore unable to take complaints about accidents, domestic violence, other situations that women may face in a language that those women are comfortable speaking. Or finally, from a Sinhalese community in the center of the country, in the case of tensions between Buddhists and Muslims, religious leaders from both sides have discussions. So when there are tensions present in the national parliament, present in the media, present even on the streets, seeing local religious leaders sit down and have conversations about them means that reconciliation is occurring in ways that make a difference for them in their everyday lives. The work undertaken by EPI's team on the ground, which included Zara, who you'll hear from in just a moment, ended up generating more than 6,000 indicators. And that's a huge amount of information. It's a huge amount of data. And I wanted to highlight this interactive online interface that I would invite you to visit later if you want to sort of dig into some of the, in more detail, the kinds of themes that were emerging out of these 6,000 indicators. And I'm happy to share the link. So here you'll see a map of the island with these little dots and blocks, and you can use the interactive interface to see not the totality of the indicators generated, but certainly examples of all the different categories and their relative prevalence. These indicators, the 6,000 of them, were voted on and were ranked. So not all of them ended up being crucial for the design of programming. But what this analytical work on the back end on EPI's side allowed us to do was to, again, sort these things into categories, look for patterns, look for themes, and give that information to global communities so as to devise programs that really were aimed to meet the needs of communities in ways that they had articulated and they had prioritized. So just to give you a sense of some of the multitude of projects that they undertook, everything from supporting livelihoods in fishing communities, in farming communities, in among, I'm seeing one, the mobile huts were for women who were unable to work in a full-time job and were able to set up a mobile hut along a major roadway and take shifts selling local products. There was work done to sensitize government officials. There were language training programs, cross-cultural exchange programs, really a multitude of different types of interventions, again, designed to meet the communities where they were in terms of what they were prioritizing to advance reconciliation. That other aim that I had mentioned previously, right, not only to inform the programs, but also to evaluate the programs. And this is the side that's very much, EPI's bread and butter, which is the research part of it. What you're looking at is a map of Sri Lanka. You will notice that there are little boxes. This is where the work was undertaken. There were a total of 30 communities, which you'll see referred to as GNDs. That's sort of the smallest political administrative unit. And that was the unit at which we were working, and also Global Communities was working. These were monoethnic communities. So some of them were Tamil communities, some of them were Muslim communities, and some of them were Sinhalese communities. These 10 clusters each contain 2 treatment communities where USAID funded programs were implemented, and 1 quote unquote control community, a roughly similar community in the same geographic region, with similar demographic and economic characteristics, where there was not any active programming, at least at the community level. I call this a quasi experimental design, because not only is it quasi experimental in the sense that the communities themselves are, of course, different, but also the programs were slightly different. And as you saw on the previous slide with everything from economic livelihoods to mediation and conflict resolution activities. But even so, having this sort of comparative structure to see how things were changing in the control communities versus how they were changing in the treatment communities ended up being really instructive in terms of understanding the results of the program. In order to collect these indicators, which was done at 2 time points, primarily at the beginning of the project in 2018 and 2019, but also later there was a smaller round of indicator generation in 2022 that Zara's going to talk about. We had direct conversations with over 1,000 people. And through these indicator-based surveys, we surveyed over 4,000 people at the beginning and at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Zara for a minute to talk us through what that felt like, what it looked like, what were some of the challenges, and how did EPI solve them on the ground. And then in the final part, I want to take you back to some of the key findings from the evaluation.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you everybody for having me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to revisit some of the work that we did in the recent past. For some of you who just joined, I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Zara Rizwan. I just started my PhD program at The Ohio State University. But I would take the next 10 minutes to kind of go back into the key learnings that myself and my team kind of gathered from administering the EPI process in Sri Lanka during a very critical moment. I'm not going to go into detail about this timeline, but I want to draw your attention specifically to these red areas that you see at the bottom, just to highlight how important the context was at that time. So when I joined EPI in mid-2022, as we all know, that was the heights of the economic and political crisis in Sri Lanka. And what that looked like for us Sri Lankans is long hours of power cuts, days spent at fuel queues because there was an island-wide shortage of fuel, shortage of food. So it impacted regardless of where in the country we were coming from or which language we spoke, we were all impacted to varying degrees at this particular moment in time. So EPI from 2018 worked in Sri Lanka till 2024, but there were so many changes in the context. For example, in 2019, we had the Easter Sunday attacks, where there was a complete shift in how, for instance, Muslims were viewed as an ethnic and religious community in the country. And then we had the pandemic. And then in 2022, where I joined, was when the economic and political crisis was at the peak. So at this point, what we did was basically revisit out of the 30 locations, we revisited a sample of them to really understand how people experience reconciliation, the idea of reconciliation, what that looked like in their everyday lives in a particular moment in time. So the first question that I had when I joined this training was like, how the hell am I supposed to go into these communities and talk to people about reconciliation when people are focused on like their daily survival needs? And often, as we know, in a post-war Sri Lankan context, reconciliation is a very loaded term, and it's often associated with inter-ethnic relationships or relations on the other hand. But I'm sure Leslie will talk to you more about what this looked like and how interesting it was for us to really look at different facets of reconciliation within these communities and how that might have differed based on whether you were a community that was very much affected by the war, or whether you came from a community that was a Sinhala majority population or a Tamil majority population or a Muslim majority population. We will look at that in detail in a bit. But I would take the next couple of minutes to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges that we faced when we were carrying out field work during this particular moment in time. And the other interesting component that really I learned a lot through this process is how we use this data to provide global communities with the necessary information to design targeted interventions. Next slide, please, Leslie. Yes, so as we predicted, when we went into these communities during the economic crisis, that was their priority concern. They were thinking about fuel, they were thinking about electricity and the inflation rates. Those were at the forefront of the concerns, because whether it was an agricultural-based community or whether it's a community that relied on, for instance, daily, we call it three-wheelers that run like daily transportation services, many facets of their lives were impacted during this crisis. But it was interesting that when we went into these communities that were already visited in 2018, there was that sense of, okay, this is an organization that's interested in learning more about how or engaging more with us rather than one-off conversations that we usually see. But a bigger concern for my team, especially our regional facilitators, we had a wonderful team like that we owe most of this success to, was that EPI is a specific methodology, as Leslie took you through. There are several steps, and then it has to be carried out in a particular manner. But most of these settings or communities that we went into were low resource settings, and they have minimum facilities. So finding spaces, especially to have that third step of the voting and the verification that requires us bringing together all these groups that we had focus group discussions with. Required, like, there were logistical challenges on the one hand. For example, the image that you see on the screen is from a remote, very remote village in the eastern province of Sri Lanka. So trying to gather communities together was a challenge. So we had to adapt on the ground, and on top of having to deal with minimum facilities, it was also an area that had like military surveillance. So for us to adapt on the ground, to be able to still maneuver these challenges, was essential, because the success of our process depended on how we were able to gather these data despite all of these challenges. And in areas where the literacy rates were varied, or there were the more elderly population being a part of verification and voting sessions, our team had to provide more support, or have to read out 200-300 indicators over and over again, so they were able to understand and vote. So there were so many challenges, but these, for now, I will just talk about these and move on to what it looked like when we had to share these indicators as data for programming with our partners. Next slide, please. So Leslie, a little while ago, just mentioned that we gathered over 6,000 indicators overall in this project. So in 2022, when we visited, it was about 2,000 indicators at that point that we added to the already collected database of indicators. And that is a huge scale, as you can imagine. So for EPI, one of the challenges was trying to figure out what was the best possible way to share this data with our partner organization in a way that they could actually understand these in the first place, because these indicators can be very specific and unique, and out of context, it may not necessarily directly give you an understanding of what the conversation was about. So that was one of the challenges from EPI, and how we maneuvered this was that we would gather like a bunch of indicators and then try to provide a recommendation out of it in terms of some of the ways in which our partner organization could design an intervention. And they found it more productive and efficient than going through lists of indicators for each community. As for them, it allowed a more broader scope in which they could design these projects. And indicators, for instance, that had like the level of intervention that required also varied. For example, let me give you an example from a community that was affected by the war. One of the indicators were talking about access to clean water. So in using such indicators, it was much less challenging for a partner organization, because they went in and provided them with a water purification center. So if it was infrastructure support, it was easy to translate these indicators directly into a project that benefited the community. But then when it comes to indicators, such as the example that Leslie showed about people that disappeared during the war, or like other kinds of war reparations, like getting your land back, that required more national and state level interventions, which cannot necessarily be directly addressed by global communities or any of their partner organizations. That was one of the another challenge that they faced, and how they kind of worked around it was, for instance, yes, they cannot directly intervene in providing people's lands back, but what they did in such situations was to build the capacity of these communities, so they're aware of their rights, they're aware of the process, and connect them with state networks, for instance, a land mediation board. So these communities were able to advocate for their issues on their own. A third factor would be conflicting indicators. For example, let's say there were a whole set of indicators from a single majority village in the central part of Sri Lanka, talking about the dress code of Muslim women, that they should not, an indicator of reconciliation for them was to not see Muslim women wear the hijab, or not see them walking around with the burqa. while indicators gathered from a neighboring Muslim village in the central part of the country was talking about their idea of reconciliation is to be able to practice their cultural or religious faith without being discriminated about it. So when our partner organization is given these conflicting indicators and they have to walk into these communities and bring them together and work on it, one of the ways in which they worked around it was to either use projects that broadly were framed around economic empowerment, because this was a time that people were largely in need of it, and they would bring these communities together and include components that involve cultural awareness about each other's faiths, why people do what they do, and to also kind of like not necessarily directly address, but also kind of touch upon certain myths and false news that people might, that form generally the basis for whether it's hate or other kinds of violence towards other ethnic communities. So those were kind of woven into the interventions that they had designed at the time. But finally, lastly, what I would like to talk about is the timeline. So the timeline between collecting data and then designing these programs and the intervention, if we kind of go back to the image of the timeline that I had initially, you would see that, yes, you would see that at the bottom, you see the green arrow, which presents that scope programming took place from 2019 till early 2020, late 2023, early 2024. And throughout that period, there was so many changes happening on the ground. So those were definitely huge challenges that they had to face. For instance, during the pandemic, they're unable to gather people and do certain things that required people moving across. So then they had mobilizers within these communities who were able to sort of take care of certain parts, certain components of the project and be able to carry them out in the situation or during the economic crisis. Look at projects, like I said before, that directly dealt with economic, financial needs of people that they prioritized through these indicators that we gathered, and then bring in other components that were prioritized through our voting sessions. So those are some of the key, I would say, challenges that we were able to discuss, and kind of like, it was very rich to understand how our partner organizations sort of navigated these challenges. I'm happy to talk further once Leslie presents our key findings, if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Like Sarah, I came on in 2022 when the EPI project had been actually paused for a little while because of the global pandemic. So I'm speaking to you about the totality of the project, but my direct experience, it was 2022, 2023, along with Sarah. And yeah, there were so many challenges along the way, but in the end, this really yielded some, I think, very, very interesting insights. And that's what I would like to share with you in the last 10 to 15 minutes so that we have some time for Q&A at the end. So what you're seeing right now is sort of the sample size and the distribution of the surveys that we undertook in 18 of the 30 communities. This was due to budgetary changes. The baseline survey was done in all 30 communities. Due to all of the changes that Zara cited when it came towards the end of the project, we decided to make some changes and to really do this longitudinal data collection well and completely in 18. So this was in equal parts 6 Tamil communities in different parts of the country, 6 Sinhalese communities also in different parts of the country, and 6 Muslim communities also in different parts of the country, but always within the clusters that you saw previously, including both these 4 programming communities, the quote unquote treatment communities, and one community that was close by to it and had similar characteristics, but did not have direct programming. So it's on the basis of the indicators we generated and the surveys that we did that I want to share with you these results. If my screen will let me advance. So in terms of the big takeaways that we learned as EPI and that we shared with USAID, with global communities, and with others is number 1, that reconciliation means very different things to different communities. That over the lifespan of this project, between 2019 and 2023, perceptions of reconciliation and of interethnic relations generally improved in the communities that we surveyed. We cannot, of course, say anything beyond our sample, but in the locations where EPI was working, the wider trend that I'll show you now with some plots is that both of those things were improving. And finally, and I think this is really critical, that locally responsive programs can actually move the needle when it comes to metrics of reconciliation generated at this hyper-local level with community members themselves. So to the first point, that reconciliation means very different things to different communities. What you are looking at is bars showing the relative proportion of indicators from different categories. These are the codes that we put onto the categories, or onto the indicators in order to group them. The relative proportion of codes from each of these different categories in the 6 clusters. So 2 Muslim clusters, each with 6 communities, 2 Tamil clusters, each with 6 communities, and so on. As you will see on the right, when we systematically engaged with men, women, and youth, asked them to define reconciliation and tell us what it looked like in their everyday lives, so many different issues came up. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, so I'll take back the obviously. One of the issues, one of the themes, one of the categories that was salient and perhaps unsurprising had to do with interethnic relations. And I dug up some of the specific numbers to share with folks who like the empirical side of things. This is the olive green bar, and it accounts for 18 to 35% of the coded indicators. Very prevalent across most of the clusters, most of the communities, though the standout is the Maritima Patu cluster, which is a Tamil cluster that actually has the communities located there actually have relatively little day-to-day interaction with people from other ethnicities, meaning that when thinking about what reconciliation would look like, it was much less about how they related to Muslims, how they related to the Sinhala majority, and it was much more about other issues. And if you keep looking at the Maritima Patu bar, you'll see that blue is very large. And I know that there's several blues, but one of those blues is public services. And this was one of the other categories that was particularly salient across many communities, many clusters. So this ranged from 13 to 25% of codes. And this was particularly high in Tamil communities, which again, were in different parts of the country, one in the far north and one in the east. But what those communities shared was a notable lack of access to quality public services, in part due to the history of place and the history of conflict. So again, when engaging them about what reconciliation meant, it was sometimes less about large-scale political reforms or interactions with other groups, and it was more about the example that Zara gave, having access to water, having access to security services, having access to a health clinic that actually had medicine. Another key category was economy. We saw this was particularly prevalent in the more low resource communities, logically, revolved largely around access to loans and credit, employment, and was particularly salient in the eastern region, which was notably one of the ones that was the most impacted by the war, and notably less prevalent in all of the Muslim communities, where, and I'll draw your attention to, I think it's a different blue, respect. So respect, which is this purple bar, is particularly large. Can you see where my mouse is? In these two clusters and the communities therein, respect as a category of many, many, many indicators, which were highly ranked, had to do with feelings, attitudes, behaviors that, from the local perspective, denoted some level of respect for traditional religious and ethnic practice. So I know this is a lot to absorb because there's a lot of colors, which is why I brought another one, which is much simpler. What you see here is those top categories: the economy, well, economic issues generally, interethnic relations, public services, respect, and the share of questions that were grouped into those categories in the different surveys, right? Because the surveys reflect those things which floated to the top, not floated, they were voted to the top by those local communities. And so the surveys themselves varied from one place to another, not only the specific questions that were asked, but also the types of themes that were being asked about. So again, the orange, interethnic relations, perhaps unsurprisingly, many indicators and hence many questions pertaining to this, but also the economy, also issues of safety. In Paravia, there were deep concerns about physical safety based on human-animal conflicts, and specifically elephants. So that was, and the fences that could have existed had never been built, in part due to migratory movements. And I won't get into lots of details, but this was a key concern in this region and an indicator of reconciliation, having this type of safety. And finally, just to draw your attention to this final purple, which is the larger category of war-related, that issues of restitution of land, reparations, information about disappeared relatives, particularly salient in Tamil communities, but also in Muslim communities, which were in their own way very, very impacted by the conflict. What I suggested previously is that perceptions of reconciliation were generally improving. So separated out by theme or category, these lines show the average level of change. So the mean score on these surveys with all of the communities grouped together, so 18 from different parts of the country, but zeroing in on the indicators pertaining to these specific themes. As you will see, these lines slope up because there was positive change. The change was not dramatic. It was statistically significant. It was not dramatic. But those same categories, and again, I dug up some of the specific numbers, indicators in the category of representation, which had to do with both political office and public servants of one's own religion or ethnicity or language group, holding positions of decision-making authority, providing services at either the local or the district level office. An increase in 12% from 2.6 to 3 over the course of 3 years, which perhaps is not a lot, but as a social scientist and understanding the depth of the problem and also the extent of the multiple crises that occurred over the course of this project, I would characterize as a huge gain. Similarly, that category of respect that we saw was so prevalent, particularly in Muslim communities, an increase of 8% from 3.3 to 3.5. And then a category that we haven't talked about very much, but language, a long-standing dispute between how the extent to which Tamil-speaking people can access education, public services, etc., in their native language, an increase of 4% from 2.9 to 3.5. Perceptions of reconciliation, as gauged using these locally generated metrics, went up in most cases, but in some, it went down. And these are the ones that went down. Note that a few of them are intimately related to the crises that Zara explained. For example, the category of stability that has to do with things being foreseeable, being able to have a routine, being able to go about your business in the day-to-day without sort of emergencies and disruptions, declined significantly. And that's unsurprising given the crises that occurred. Similarly, in the category of intra-community dynamics, so relationships within families, between neighbors, and also in sort of village council settings, saw a decline. And our qualitative work suggested that this had to do with the stay-at-home orders, the quarantines, and the sort of pressure cooker that that COVID brought about, coupled with economic suffering. That yes, there was increased level of conflict within communities in many cases. And finally, indicators related to the military and war-related issues, reparations, information about the disappeared. The same questions that were asked in 2019, when re-asked in 2023, actually got lower scores in many cases. And we interpret this as sort of this cumulative frustration with demands or needs or grievances that have been on the table for more than a decade now, and that in many cases have not been attended to, which even in the span of 4 years, surveying the same community around the same issue, they're saying not only is it bad, it's worse than before. And it's very much about that frustration of the lack of progress. So largely a story of success, which interestingly, and I'll speed through these last few, is occurred against a backdrop of improved interethnic relations. Here what you're seeing small changes, positive changes, statistically significant changes in the majority of cases, does not reflect the questions that we asked based on indicators that communities generated, but they are based on a standard battery of questions that were asked in all of the communities about the quantity and quality of interactions with other ethnic groups. And so what's interesting, and I want to point out, is that the two findings sort of dovetail together and point in the same direction in terms of positive, small positive changes over the time period of the project. At this point, if I were you, I would be saying, but what about the USAID programs? What about the SCORE programs? What do we know about the impact of those? And what can these indicator-based surveys tell us? So I alluded previously to the quasi-experimental design. What you are looking at now is the mean perception of reconciliation in each of the 18 communities surveyed, organized by cluster, with the blue ones being the ones that received programs and the red ones being the comparison cases at these two critical times. So at the beginning of the project and at the end of the project. What you perhaps can take away visually, consistent with what I've already told you, is that almost all of those lines are sloping upwards. The change was significant. It was certainly much steeper in a few communities, and much more modest in most of them. But that in the end, the difference, there's not as much difference between the control communities and the treatment communities that a difference of differences analysis would require to say, yes, it was these programs, it was these SCORE programs that causally made reconciliation increase in these locations and increase less in these others. And hopefully that was not, it was technical enough without being overly technical. We would expect to see a higher rate of change in the treatment communities for this to be sort of a causally significant takeaway. However, there are multiple ways to parse this same data. And as I think Zara's explanation and examples really set us up to understand, the USAID funded partner, Global Communities, could never have acted on the totality of indicators. There were too many, they were too diverse. And as Zara noted, some of them were not amenable to programs at the community level. So what we ended up doing, and Zara was very much part of this, was matching all of those final project documents, all of the things that Global Communities and its partners did over the course of these 4 years with the indicators, with all of those 600 indicators that made their way into the surveys on a one-by-one basis to say this was addressed by a project, this was indirectly addressed, or this was not addressed at all. And this final analysis, which comes in 2 parts, shows us that, in fact, those indicators which were addressed through some sort of programming designed specifically around those needs, those grievances, those suggestions, increased more than those which were not, which may not be the causal silver bullet that some of us would like, but certainly suggests and provides some evidence for the idea that these locally driven, locally informed programs can move the needle in terms of issues that have been prioritized by communities and metrics aimed at measuring them. So I will leave it there. Oh, and I wanted to remind you that behind all the lines and graphs is very concrete indicators. So how often do you notice that Sinhalese people have a good understanding about Islam? The same program that Zara referenced that had to do with bringing people together across religious divides, up 35%. How much do Sinhalese and Muslims in Kuragota protect each other, even when there are problems in other parts of the country? Up 23%. And how often are people who speak Tamil serving in the Manchulai hospital? Up 18%. So with that, I will leave you, and hopefully we have time for a couple of questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Zara. There was an absolutely intriguing and brilliant presentation. Even though we're at time, I am happy to keep it open for about 10 minutes for Q&A. And also, since we are a smaller group now, feel free to turn your camera on and ask a question directly from the speakers if you wish to. If not, I'll have a quick question to get the ball rolling. This was so nuanced in terms of the geographic findings, it differs from place to place. I was wondering, did you notice any differences in values or challenges with gender and age groups?
Should I take that one? Zara, do you want to?
You can get started and I can add.
Yes, but we haven't, in the scope of this project, we did not have the time and the resources to do the empirical analysis for me to be able to tell you how much more women voted for certain themes versus others. Whether, perceptions of particular issues were starkly different across those demographic groups. What I can say is that when we disaggregated the survey results, at least by gender, there were not major differences in terms of how people perceived these issues having to do with respect and public services. So generally speaking, similar perceptions on these issues. But I think there's more to be explored there.
Thank you. Thank you. I will just go from the bottom, Phyllis. You will get the slides hopefully in 24 hours, if not 48 hours. AES will send it to you. Misinformation. I think Zara, you have addressed the question on misinformation. There's a lot in this person. There's a lot of data, and here there's Emily. Emily, you're asking a question about a midterm evaluation for 2021. Feel free to turn your camera on.
Yeah, I think Zara has already answered my question. So
Okay.
I'm looking,
Okay.
yeah, looking at her comments. Good. Yeah, just want to understand the relationship of those reports and what's the purpose of those reports. Yeah.
I think, David, your question has also been addressed. How many people did we have in the Sri Lankan team? That's from Katarina.
So the project started when the project started out, prior to Zara and I joining. The main force behind it was the founder of EPI, who is American, and a close colleague of hers who is the research advisor, who is also American but was living in Europe. And at that point, the team on the ground was actually subcontracted. So the indicator generation process under their training and guidance was carried out by Social Scientists Association, which is a local research and survey firm that also did the surveys both for the baseline and the end line. And they are absolutely fabulous, do really, really good work. But somebody mentioned the midline assessment, which was internal rather than project focused. One of the big lessons learned was the importance of having a committed EPI team on the ground, comprised of folks like Zara, who do and always will understand a lot more about how best to do this work and how best to interpret the results. So a major change made after sort of the reactivation of the project post-COVID was to hire a local team on the ground. So Zara was our lead facilitator and researcher. There was a national level project coordinator. And under you two, when you were doing the second round of indicator generation, was probably 6 more people. And then for the qualitative assessment, it was 2 additional people. Is that right?
Wow, it's a lot of work. David is asking about project design, project selection for design. I'm assuming that was directed by USAID, the donor. Can you, David's question, can you explain more about how you choose which projects to design? Is this based on assumed needs?
Yeah, so EPI did not, we provided data, raw data, process data, and recommendations for projects on the basis of the work that we had done at the outset of the project. We did not make any of the final determinations about which projects, about what the project focus should be and sort of who the implementing partners should be. So that was very much in the hands of global communities. What I can say very much to their credit is that they were able to make their sort of standard operating procedures more flexible in light of this, and to, rather than sort of come in from the outside with a predetermined project structure, to actually invite proposals from local, whether grassroots organizations or in some cases actually quasi-governmental organizations, to be able to do very work that really responds to concrete needs in the location. And perhaps, Zara, you could just talk a couple minutes about the psychosocial support project, which I think is a really good example of that. The hospital-based one.
Sorry, I was not following, Lizzie. I was not following. Sorry.
That,
I was trying
during
to
the
last question on the chat.
Sorry. No, somebody just asked about the project design, and I had said that global communities had made their requirements sort of more flexible to invite proposals from actors and organizations that under other circumstances perhaps wouldn't have had the opportunity to receive these funds and to implement locally designed programs. And the one that comes to mind actually is the hospital-based counseling and psychosocial support program from, I believe, Ampara, that was really out of the box.
Yeah, so basically, because global communities would contract different local partners based on their expertise areas and other kinds of criteria that they meet, the nature of this project was different because they couldn't necessarily follow the usual, just like Leslie said, the usual procedure of like gathering, calling for like proposals and providing like the usual procedures that they followed. So in the case of, for example, in Ampara, they had a local partner that was a community-based organization, didn't necessarily work like the usual nonprofit that was funding-based, because they had their own crowdsourced and crowdfunding processes. So what GC then had done is look at the work that they were already doing and kind of support that work to be able to address the needs that these communities in those particular locations had expressed. So largely flexibility. But in terms of assumed needs, I would say these needs were the needs that were presented by the communities and prioritized via the voting session. So we basically provide that information to GC that they are then able to decide, okay, these are the 10 top priority needs, and like, let's design projects based on those needs.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Zara. I'm not sure if I'm just checking the questions, just making sure I have not forgotten any of your questions. Please feel free to ask a question directly as I am doing this, because it's easy to miss them. I think I missed a question by Andrew Collins. Have I missed? Here we are.
Sure. Yeah, I was basically just wondering on a more macro level, this all sounds very, democratic and wonderful in a lot of ways that would appeal to wider policy circles. I'm wondering what the general uptake of these approaches has been, because what you're saying, Leslie, about the openness to sort of a more elicitive programming format, that's a trend that's now very much recognized and embraced in a lot of development studies and peacebuilding literature and practice. And where do you think resistance is coming from if this hasn't sort of become the norm yet?
Thank you for the question. We have that's the spirit, the reason that EPI was founded. And I would very much, pass the baton to the founder and CEO of EPI, who wondered precisely this 10 years ago and said, how do we fix it, right? Where I sit and having seen what I have in the last 2 years, I think there are multiple barriers to broadly embracing this sort of elicitive design. To be self-critical for a moment, in terms of this actual project, working in this way is quite expensive. So we can tell you with great levels of detail what is happening or what was happening in 2019 and in 2022 in these 30 small political administrative units of Sri Lanka, but there are how many GNDs in Sri Lanka, Zara? I think it's 5,000.
Oh, in total, about 2,000.
2,000. So working at that scale certainly requires a huge amount of resources in terms of both money and time. And so, logically, that is a barrier. There are other sort of more nuanced issues that Zara touched on, and we could go into a lot of more detail about contradictory indicators, right? What she referred to as contradictory indicators. There is a huge amount of value with engaging directly with affected populations about the issues that most impact their lives negatively. That said, I think Sri Lanka is not unusual. And I expect that we would see this in the United States. Certainly we've seen it in Colombia as well, that there are some issues that are hard to grapple with at sort of a normative level, right? That due to misinformation, due to historical tensions, due to sort of NIMBY effects, there's a lot of things going on. Maybe folks who are investing money in development programming would want, I'm trying to be delicate about how they say this, would want to push for socioeconomic equality or less inequality or gender norms that move in a particular direction that may not be where a particular population is at that moment. So I think that stuff is very real. And we don't always have the best tools to sort of grapple with it. So I think that I think it's honest to acknowledge it as a barrier. And I think moving past it means working through what it means. I hope that answers your question. And then, of course, bureaucratic systems that are just thought of from the top down and very, very inflexible sometimes.
Thank you, Leslie. There is a follow-up question by Bill. Given the expense of this approach, have you considered low-cost approaches that use heuristic indicators like community scorecards?
I don't have a good answer to that. As far as I know, with the work I've been involved in, this has been the approach to use, but it is entirely possible that other folks are in this broader network are thinking about that. And I think that's a move in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Zara. As it's 15 minutes past the hour, I will officially close it. Thank you so much to our speakers for a fantastic and informative presentation. Many of the researchers, evaluators, policy workers, and NGO workers here today would be grappling with some of the opportunities and challenges that you have presented today. And if you have any more questions, I know this is a huge piece of work. Please do email Leslie. Her email is right on the screen.